The arrogant millionaire brutally shames a quiet black waitress inside a luxury Manhattan gala, completely unaware that he just signed the death warrant for his own career. In just 10 seconds, a chair in the dim corner will move, and absolute authority will step into the light, and New York's wealthiest elite will be forced to watch a flawless empire completely collapse. You are about to witness the most satisfying, jaw-dropping corporate reversal ever caught on camera. "Don't touch her" was not supposed to be heard in a place like this, yet the words cut through the air of the Harrington room at the Sterling Grand Hotel in Manhattan like a blade made of pure authority. And for a brief moment, even the crystal chandeliers seemed to pause in their slow, elegant glow. Conversations collapsed into silence. Forks hovered midair above white porcelain plates, and the soft piano music in the corner felt suddenly distant, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. At the far end of the dining hall, Aaliyah Johnson stood still in her black uniform, hands steady but eyes sharpened by disbelief, as the attention of half a dozen powerful guests shifted toward her like a spotlight she never asked for. She was only 26, working double shifts to keep her life together in a city that never slowed down for anyone, especially not for someone like her. Yet tonight something in the air felt heavier than usual, like the room itself had chosen a side before the story even began. Across from her stood a group of affluent patrons dressed in tailored suits and expensive confidence, their laughter too sharp, their tone too practiced, the kind of people who spoke as if the world had already agreed with them. One of them leaned slightly forward, voice dripping with entitlement as he questioned her presence, not loudly at first, but deliberately enough for others to hear, turning discomfort into entertainment, and Aaliyah felt the familiar weight of being reduced to something smaller than her name. Near the edge of the room, seated in a dim corner that most guests had already forgotten existed, was a man in a simple charcoal suit, unremarkable at first glance, blending into the architecture of wealth around him, yet his eyes never left the scene unfolding near the center. That man was William Harrington, though no one at the table had recognized him, and he had chosen it that way, observing without interruption, expression unreadable, as if waiting for a moment only he could see coming. Aaliyah adjusted her grip on the tray she carried, forcing her posture to remain composed as another comment landed across the table, softer than the first but sharper in meaning, and the tension between dignity and humiliation began to tighten like a wire pulled too far. The room did not yet know it, but every second was drawing something closer to the surface, something that would not remain hidden for long, because William Harrington had already started to rise slowly from his seat, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to change the atmosphere of the room. The movement from the corner of the room was so subtle at first that only those closest to the dimly lit section noticed it. A slight shift of fabric, a measured rise from the chair, the kind of motion that carried no urgency, but somehow changed the temperature of the entire space. William Harrington stepped forward slowly, his presence no longer blending into the background of linen tables and polished glass, and yet still no one fully recognized what was happening, because men like him rarely announced themselves in places like this. The affluent guests at the center table continued speaking for a brief moment longer, unaware that the attention of the room was beginning to drift away from them, as if an invisible current had started pulling every gaze in a different direction. Aaliyah Johnson remained still, her hands steady at her sides, though something in her posture had shifted, a quiet instinct telling her that the balance in the room was no longer what it had been seconds earlier. The man who had been speaking to her earlier, dressed in an expensive navy suit with a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes, leaned back slightly, as if expecting the situation to resolve itself without consequence, but the silence growing around them suggested otherwise. William continued walking forward, each step deliberate, unhurried, until he reached the edge of the central dining space, where the lighting grew brighter and the attention more concentrated, and only then did a few staff members begin to recognize that this was not an ordinary guest. A low murmur spread across the room, fragmented and uncertain, as one of the managers shifted uncomfortably near the service station, suddenly aware that something important had been overlooked. Aaliyah's eyes briefly met William's, not in recognition, but in confusion, because there was no explanation in his expression, only calm certainty, as if he had already accepted the outcome of whatever was about to unfold. The man in the navy suit frowned slightly, sensing the change in atmosphere but still unaware of its source, until William finally stopped a few feet away from the table and let the silence settle completely. It was not a dramatic entrance, not a confrontation, not a display of force, but something far more unsettling, the kind of presence that did not need to raise its voice to command attention. Aaliyah felt her heartbeat slow for reasons she could not explain, as if instinct itself was recalibrating the situation in real time, while the guests around her began to glance between one another, searching for context that no one seemed to have. Then, with a calmness that did not match the tension in the room, William spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that every word carried to the farthest corner of the dining hall. And in that moment, the identity he had hidden until now began to surface in the awareness of those listening. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place too late to stop what was already in motion. And as the first whispers of recognition began to spread, Aaliyah found herself standing at the center of something far larger than the moment she had been living just seconds before. The recognition did not come from everyone at once, but it spread through the room in uneven waves, beginning with those who understood the weight of certain names before they were even spoken aloud. A waiter near the far wall froze mid-step, tray trembling slightly as he leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that immediately changed the expression on both of their faces. At the central table, the man in the navy suit finally noticed the shift, not because of what was said, but because of how people were suddenly no longer looking at him. William Harrington remained still, his posture calm, his presence now fully anchored in the space, and when he spoke again, it was not louder than before, but somehow even more definitive, as if the room itself had accepted that the conversation no longer belonged to anyone else. Aaliyah Johnson stood quietly just a few feet away, her hands still lowered, though her breathing had become more measured, as if she was trying to understand whether she was still part of the situation or had become an observer to something unfolding beyond her control. The man in the navy suit forced a small laugh, uncomfortable and uncertain, trying to regain the rhythm of authority he had lost without realizing it, but no one followed his lead. Instead, attention continued to shift toward William, whose identity was now becoming clear in fragments of overheard words and exchanged glances, references to boardrooms, corporate decisions, and leadership that carried influence far beyond the walls of the Sterling Grand Hotel. A manager near the service station stepped forward slightly, then stopped, as if unsure whether approaching would help or worsen what was already happening, while the atmosphere grew heavier with recognition and hesitation. William finally turned his gaze toward the man who had been speaking earlier, and in that simple movement, the entire tone of the room changed again, not through aggression or volume, but through certainty. Aaliyah felt the weight of that shift deeply, though no one had addressed her directly, because for the first time that evening, the dynamic that had isolated her was no longer intact. The man in the navy suit attempted to respond, but his words lost coherence halfway through, dissolving under the pressure of realization as he began to understand that the person he had been dismissing was not an ordinary guest at all. William did not interrupt him immediately, instead allowing the silence to expand until it became unbearable, and only then did he speak a single sentence that carried the full authority of his position, a sentence that reframed everything that had happened up to this point without raising his voice. The effect was immediate and irreversible, as the remaining confidence in the room collapsed into stunned stillness, and even those who had no direct involvement found themselves standing straighter, aware that they were witnessing a moment that would not be forgotten. Aaliyah's eyes remained fixed on William, not out of fear, but out of disbelief, because the situation she had been enduring minutes earlier now felt like it belonged to another version of reality, one that was already being rewritten in real time. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of confusion, but the silence of recognition settling into place, heavy and irreversible, as if the room itself had accepted that the rules it once operated under no longer applied. William Harrington stood still for a moment longer, allowing the weight of his presence to fully register across every corner of the dining hall, where conversations had completely dissolved into watchful stillness. The man in the navy suit finally understood that this was not a negotiation, not a misunderstanding, and not a moment that could be redirected with charm or deflection, because the structure of authority in the room had already shifted beyond his control. Aaliyah Johnson remained near the center of it all, though she no longer felt like the center of attention in the same way, as the energy around her had transformed from scrutiny into something closer to reluctant awareness. William turned slightly, his gaze moving between the guests and the staff, not with aggression, but with a calm precision that made every detail of the room feel exposed under a brighter light. A manager near the service station stepped forward again, this time stopping only when William raised a subtle hand, not as a command, but as a quiet indication that no further interruption was necessary. The guests at the table who had once carried themselves with ease and confidence now adjusted their posture, some lowering their gaze, others attempting to process how quickly familiarity had turned into uncertainty. Aaliyah felt a shift in her breathing again, slower now, steadier, as if the tension that had been tightening around her earlier had begun to loosen without any action on her part. The man in the navy suit attempted to speak once more, but his words came out measured and uncertain, stripped of the authority they once carried, as he began to realize that every assumption he had made earlier that evening no longer held any relevance. William listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when he finally responded, it was not in the form of escalation, but in a controlled statement that reframed the entire situation in a way that left no space for argument. The effect was immediate across the room, not dramatic in volume, but absolute in impact, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn that everyone instinctively understood not to cross. Aaliyah's eyes remained fixed on him, searching for meaning in the transformation she was witnessing, because what had started as an ordinary night of work had now become something far beyond anything she had ever experienced in her life. Around her, the atmosphere had settled into a new kind of order, one defined not by the assumptions that had governed the room before, but by a clarity that no one could ignore, and in that clarity, every person present began to understand that the story unfolding before them was no longer about status or appearance, but about a truth that had already taken control of the room. The room no longer felt like a place built for conversation, but like a suspended moment where every breath carried meaning, every glance held consequence, and every silence had become louder than words. William Harrington remained composed at the center of it all, his presence no longer questioned, only acknowledged in quiet fragments of realization that passed between guests like invisible signals. The man in the navy suit stood rigidly now, his earlier confidence replaced by an uneasy awareness that every attempt to reclaim control would only deepen the imbalance already established. Aaliyah Johnson felt that shift more than anyone, not because she was being spoken about, but because for the first time that night, she was no longer being reduced to background noise in her own environment. William's gaze briefly returned to her, not with judgment, but with a measured calm that suggested he was evaluating more than just the situation in front of them, as if he had already seen beyond it. The surrounding guests remained silent, some exchanging glances that carried a mixture of confusion and recognition, while others simply waited, uncertain of what the correct response to this moment should be. The manager near the service station lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging an invisible boundary that had already been established without formal instruction. Aaliyah adjusted her stance subtly, her shoulders no longer carrying the same tension, though her mind was still processing the speed at which everything had changed. The man in the navy suit finally broke the silence again, attempting to reframe his position with carefully chosen words, but the tone lacked its earlier certainty, replaced instead by hesitation that even he could not fully conceal. William did not interrupt immediately, allowing the words to settle and expose their own instability before responding with a controlled clarity that removed any remaining ambiguity from the situation. When he spoke, it was not an escalation, but a conclusion forming in real time, and the effect was immediate across the entire room, as if every listener had instinctively understood that the matter had moved beyond discussion. Aaliyah felt a quiet shift inside herself, not of fear or relief, but of awareness, as if she was witnessing the final alignment of events she had never been part of deciding. Around her, The guests who had once carried themselves with unquestioned authority now stood in a different emotional posture, one shaped by realization rather than confidence, as the structure they had relied on no longer held the same meaning. William's expression remained unchanged, yet his presence now carried the unmistakable weight of resolution, and in that resolution, the room had already begun to reorganize itself without instruction. Aaliyah looked forward, no longer as someone caught in the center of uncertainty, but as someone beginning to understand that the situation she had been pulled into was no longer defined by the assumptions that had started it. The silence that had settled over the room was no longer uncertain or fragile, but structured, as if every person present had unconsciously agreed to follow a new rhythm dictated not by social hierarchy, but by the weight of what had just been revealed. William Harrington stood without movement for a moment longer, his calm expression unchanged, yet the space around him felt increasingly defined by his presence rather than the environment itself. The man in the navy suit, once confident in tone and posture, now appeared as though every word he had spoken earlier had been stripped of its authority and left exposed under a clearer light. Aaliyah Johnson remained still, though her attention was no longer locked on the confrontation alone, but on the subtle transformation of the room itself, where reactions had shifted from disbelief to reluctant acknowledgement. Around her, guests no longer whispered with confusion, but with fragments of understanding that connected into something irreversible, as names, titles, and implications began to surface in quiet recognition. The manager near the service station lowered his gaze completely now, stepping back slightly, as if distance alone could restore order, but nothing in the room suggested that the previous order still existed. William finally turned his attention fully toward the man in the navy suit, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a controlled finality that left no space for interpretation or defense. The words were not loud, yet they cut through every remaining layer of uncertainty, causing even those who were not directly involved to shift their stance in subtle awareness. Aaliyah felt a strange stillness within herself, not emotional collapse nor relief, but something closer to clarity, as if she was no longer standing inside a moment of conflict, but inside the resolution of one. The man in the navy suit attempted to respond once more, but his effort dissolved before completion, replaced by silence that now felt self-imposed rather than imposed by others. William did not press further, because there was no need to, and that absence of pressure itself became the final confirmation of the shift that had already occurred. Guests who had previously occupied the space of observers now seemed cautious in their movements, as though any unnecessary action might disturb a balance they did not fully understand. Aaliyah's breathing steadied as she looked across the room, realizing that what had begun as a moment of discomfort had transformed into something far more absolute in its conclusion. William's presence remained unchanged, but the meaning attached to it had fully settled across the room, and in that settled understanding, the earlier tension no longer had anywhere to return. The final traces of uncertainty in the room faded not through force, but through acceptance, as if every person present had silently agreed that what had just unfolded could no longer be interpreted in any other way. William Harrington remained composed, his presence no longer shifting the atmosphere because the atmosphere itself had already adapted around him. The man in the navy suit stood motionless for a moment longer, his earlier confidence now completely dissolved, replaced by a stillness that carried the weight of understanding rather than resistance. Aaliyah Johnson felt the change not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual easing, like a pressure that had been holding the space in place had finally been released. Around her, guests no longer exchanged uncertain glances, but instead looked forward with quiet awareness, as if they were witnessing the conclusion of something they had misread from the beginning. William finally turned his attention away from the center table and toward the wider room, his gaze steady, measured, and no longer focused on conflict but on resolution. When he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now it held a different purpose, not to correct, not to challenge, but to close the distance between misunderstanding and clarity. The man in the navy suit lowered his head slightly, not in protest, but in recognition that further words would no longer serve any purpose in this moment. Aaliyah remained still, her posture unchanged, though something within her had shifted into a quieter state, one that no longer anticipated escalation, but instead processed the unfamiliar experience of being acknowledged without distortion. William's words continued briefly, addressing the situation with precision and finality, ensuring that what had occurred would not be misrepresented or softened by interpretation. The room listened without interruption, not because they were commanded to, but because they understood that the moment required nothing else. As the final words settled, William's attention returned briefly to Aaliyah, and in that brief moment of eye contact, there was no hierarchy, no performance of authority, only recognition. It was not a declaration, but a quiet acknowledgement that her presence in the situation had mattered beyond what anyone in the room had initially assumed. Aaliyah felt that recognition without needing to respond, because nothing in her required validation in that instant, only understanding. Around them, the guests began to slowly resume subtle movement, not returning to their previous behavior, but adjusting to a reality that had permanently shifted their perspective. The man in the navy suit finally stepped back from the table, his departure unremarkable in motion but significant in meaning, as though the space no longer required his presence to define what had happened. William remained for a moment longer, ensuring that the silence now carried stability rather than tension, before allowing his stance to relax slightly, signaling that the moment had reached its natural conclusion. Aaliyah stood in the center of what remained, no longer defined by disruption or observation, but by a quiet certainty that the night had ended differently than it had begun, leaving behind a truth that could not be undone or ignored. The room no longer held the weight of confrontation, but something quieter and more enduring, like the afterimage of a storm that had already passed but left every surface slightly changed. William Harrington remained where he stood for a moment longer, not as a figure of disruption, but as someone confirming that no further correction was necessary. The guests around the dining hall had begun to settle into careful movement again, though their behavior no longer carried the same casual certainty it once had. Conversations resumed in fragments, but no one spoke at the same volume or with the same confidence as before, as if every word now required additional thought before being released into the air. Aaliyah Johnson stayed near the center of the space, her hands still steady at her sides, her presence no longer defined by observation, but by quiet endurance of what had just taken place. William finally shifted his stance, not as a departure, but as a transition, as though the moment itself had reached its natural limit and no longer needed to be held in place. The man in the navy suit had already moved away from the table, his absence now more noticeable than his earlier presence, not because of what he had done, but because of how completely the room had stopped revolving around him. Aaliyah's gaze followed the subtle changes in the environment, noticing how staff members resumed their duties with careful precision, as if relearning how to exist within a space that had been temporarily redefined. William's attention briefly returned to her once more, not to instruct or to intervene, but to acknowledge without words that what had occurred did not diminish her position within the moment. There was no expectation in his expression, only a calm recognition that settled between them and then dissolved into the surrounding silence. Aaliyah felt that recognition not as pressure, but as release, as though she was no longer required to interpret herself through the reactions of others in that room. Around them, guests gradually returned to their conversations, though the rhythm had changed, slower and more deliberate, as if everyone was still recalibrating what normal now meant. The manager near the service station straightened slightly, exchanging brief signals. With staff that carried a renewed sense of order, but even that order felt different from before, less automatic and more intentional. William took one final glance across the room, ensuring that the environment had stabilized into something coherent, before allowing his presence to ease back into stillness. Aaliyah remained where she was, no longer the focus of disruption or attention, but part of a space that had been permanently altered by what had been revealed. Nothing in the room returned to what it had been at the beginning of the night, because even in silence, everything now carried the memory of understanding that could not be reversed. By the time the last traces of tension had fully dissolved, the Sterling Grand Hotel dining hall had already returned to its natural rhythm, though nothing about it felt exactly the same as it had at the beginning of the evening. Conversations resumed at tables scattered across the room, but the tone was softer now, more careful, as if everyone present had silently agreed that some subjects no longer belonged in casual conversation. Aaliyah Johnson stood near the center for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because she was unsure of what to do next, but because the shift from pressure to stillness felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. Around her, staff members moved with renewed coordination, clearing glasses and adjusting settings with quiet efficiency, avoiding unnecessary attention while still aware that something significant had taken place. William Harrington remained for a brief moment near the edge of the space, his presence no longer dominating the environment, but still quietly shaping how people moved within it. There was no announcement of departure, no final statement, only a gradual easing of attention away from him as the room accepted that the moment of change had already completed itself. Aaliyah finally exhaled in a steady breath, her shoulders relaxing in a way that suggested she was only now realizing how long she had been holding herself still. The man in the navy suit was no longer visible in the central area, his earlier presence reduced to memory rather than influence, and no one spoke of him as. The room continued to normalize itself around a new sense of balance. William turned slightly as if confirming once more that everything had settled correctly, then allowed his posture to ease, signaling that his involvement in the situation had reached its natural conclusion. Aaliyah's eyes briefly met his again, not out of obligation or uncertainty, but out of quiet acknowledgement, and in that moment there was no hierarchy between them, only a shared understanding that the night had moved through a transformation neither of them would forget. William gave no further instruction, no final message, only a calm nod that carried the weight of closure without needing to define it. Aaliyah returned a subtle expression of understanding, not spoken, not performed, but simply present. Around them, the restaurant continued its operations, yet every detail now felt slightly recalibrated, as if the space itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Guests resumed their meals, staff resumed their work, and the atmosphere stabilized into something recognizable again, though less rigid than before. William finally turned away and moved toward the exit with an unhurried pace, disappearing from attention not as a departure of importance, but as a completion of purpose. Aaliyah remained for a moment longer, then slowly returned to her duties, carrying herself differently than she had earlier, not because her position had changed, but because her understanding of it had. Nothing was spoken aloud about what had happened, yet everything in the room reflected it in quiet, invisible ways. And as the evening continued, the memory of that moment lingered not as disruption, but as realization that in a single night, the meaning of power, presence, and recognition had quietly been rewritten without a single raised voice. Wealth can buy you a tailored suit, but it can never purchase a soul. The arrogant who treat the innocent like background noise will always find themselves completely destroyed when true power speaks. Aaliyah Johnson protected her dignity in a room designed to take it away, and justice finally found its home. But this is only the beginning of what happens when the elite get a reality check. If you believe that silent integrity should always crush empty pride, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't stop here. The next mind-blowing story of hidden wealth and shocking redemption is already playing on your screen right now. Click on it immediately, because you won't believe what happens when another corrupt executive gets caught in the ultimate trap. See you in the next video.